And we're continuing with the third chapter of The Eyes of the Killer Robot. The professor has taken Fergie and Johnny to a pawn shop, and there they have been spied by the villain. Time passed. It was the middle of July, and the days were blazing hot. Fergie and Johnny played chess and drank iced tea by the gallon, and they went to movies and gobbled hot fudge sundaes at Peter's sweet shop. Sometimes, when they were sitting on the Dixons' front porch on a warm evening, they talked about the snuff box and the sword cane. Both these things had come to them in a very mysterious way, and they wanted to know who the owner had been. The professor had gone over the box and the cane with a magnifying glass, but he did not find any initials or other identifying marks. He had also called up Mr. Chigwell, but he had not been any help either. He explained that his grandfather had never kept any record of the names of people who pawned things at his shop. The professor remarked that the owner had probably been a man because snuff boxes and canes were carried around by men in the old days, but beyond that, they knew absolutely nothing. As the month wore on, Johnny began to get the old feeling that he was being watched. Every now and then he would be walking up Fillmore Street, and an old blue Ford would come cruising past. Johnny knew that there was more than one blue Ford in the world, but this one had a dented right fender and a missing hubcap. He had seen it downtown on Merrimack Street and in other places. It always seemed to be disappearing around a corner as he turned to look. Johnny knew that he sometimes imagined things, and at first he told himself that he was being silly. But then other things began to happen. The phone would ring late at night, and when Johnny got up and ran downstairs to answer it, he would hear nothing but a dial tone at the other end. And twice he had letters mailed to him with a blank piece of paper inside. Naturally, there wasn't any return address on the envelope either time. When Johnny told Fergie about these weird occurrences, Fergie seemed thoroughly unconcerned. "It's just some nut having himself a good time," he said nonchalantly. "There's crazies everywhere, and most of them don't hurt anybody. That's what my dad says anyway." "Yeah?" Johnny grumbled. "Well, it's not your dad who's getting followed around. What if it's some guy that wants to kidnap me?" Fergie laughed loudly. "Ha! Kidnap you? Good God, Dixon. Are you batty? Your grandma and grandpa have got about $12.03 and a Canadian nickel in the bank." "Yeah, but my dad's got some money," said Johnny stubbornly. Johnny's father was a career officer in the Air Force. Johnny did not get to see him often, but they wrote letters to each other. Johnny and Fergie argued some more, but Fergie was hard to convince. He absolutely refused to believe that Johnny was in any kind of danger. Several days passed, and Johnny did not see any blue Fords or get any mysterious midnight phone calls. He decided, reluctantly, that Fergie was right, and he tried to put the nagging fears behind him. Nothing bad could possibly happen. August came with with it muggy weather and thunderstorms. One rainy night, Johnny sat up late reading and listening to The Voice of Firestone Hour, a musical program that he liked. On the table next to his chair was a plate of crackers spread with pimento-flavored cream cheese. And now and then Johnny would pause in his reading and grab a cracker and stuff it into his mouth. Rain rattled against the bay window, and thunder muttered and grumbled in the distance. As he turned the pages, Johnny began to realize that he was not paying attention to the story he was reading. Was he bored or just sleepy? He really couldn't tell which. The sessions clock in the dining room wanged 11 times, and Johnny closed the book. He found that he was thinking about the mysterious snuff box, which was up in his room. Johnny had been examining it earlier in the day to see if maybe there was some sliding panel on its bottom that would reveal a secret hiding place, but there were no secrets to be found. It was just an empty box. Why did the stupid box fascinate him so much? He had no idea why. Johnny realized that he was getting sleepy. With a sigh, he reached over and turned off the radio and hauled himself to his feet. When he got to his room, Johnny reached in past the door frame and flipped the light switch. But at that instant, there was a horrendous crash of thunder, and the lights in the room and the hallway flickered and went out. "Phooey," said Johnny, who hated it when the power went out. He could not see very well in the dark, but he groped his way into the room. His fingers found the old nickel-plated flashlight on top of his bureau. Switching it on, he propped it up with a book so the beam pointed toward him. Then he sat down on the bed and started taking off his shoes. As he undressed, Johnny wondered what had happened to the power. Had a tree limb fallen on a line? Or had a car skidded on the wet pavement and rammed a utility pole? Then he wondered if the food in the refrigerator would spoil if the power was off all night. Entertaining himself with thoughts like these, Johnny got his clothes off and put on his pajamas. But just as he was turning to pull down the bedspread, he froze. Out of the corner of his eye, he had seen something. There was a figure crouching on the porch roof outside his bedroom window. An icy breath of fear blew over Johnny's body. In a flash, he knew that the creature was someone who shouldn't be there, someone who couldn't be there. It was a visitor from another world. Slowly, Johnny turned to face the thing. The flashlight's beam cast a ghastly sheen on the window, and beyond the glass, Johnny saw a fearfully thin shape shuffling forward on his knees. As Johnny watched, rigid with terror, the shadowy form groped at the window, and then Johnny blacked out, and he fell in a heap on the floor. When Johnny woke up, rain was blowing in through the half-open window. Cold drops tickled his face and made him sit up and shake his head violently. Quickly, he glanced to his right. The figure was gone. Dragging himself to his feet, Johnny tottered over to the bureau. He began groping with his hands, and at the instant the lights came back on, Johnny blinked and stared. The thing he had been looking for, the snuff box, was gone. He came back for it, Johnny thought. It was his, and he took it. Johnny didn't know who he was, but he was sure that the shadowy man had come for the snuff box. He had read somewhere that ghosts could use talisman or magic objects when they wanted to appear to people and warn them about dangers or do good deeds for them. But once the ghost's mission was accomplished, the talisman had to be returned to the dark void, to the place it had come from. These ghostly rules seemed strange to Johnny, but they made a crazy kind of sense. Wearily, Johnny sat down on the bed, and he tried hard to think. He had an overpowering urge to call up the professor, but he knew how the professor hated being awakened out of a sound sleep, so he resisted the urge. Pounding his forehead with his hand, Johnny forced himself to think. The snuff box had been sent, and it had been taken away, but why? Apparently the box wasn't important, but the pawn ticket was. So the ghost, or whatever it was, had meant for them to have the sword cane. But what were they supposed to do with it? Stab somebody? Threaten somebody? But who? At this point, Johnny's reasoning ran into a stone wall. Then he thought about the blue Ford and the mysterious phone calls. What did they have to do with anything? Johnny pressed his hands to his face, and his head began to throb. All this thinking had gotten him a rotten headache. Wearily, Johnny dragged himself to his feet, and then he went out of the room and down the hall to the bathroom. He took 2 aspirin tablets and washed them down with a glass of water. He stumbled back to his bed and fell into a dead, dreamless sleep. The next morning after breakfast, Johnny decided that he had better go across the street and have a talk with the professor. By now, Johnny was used to bursting in on the professor at any hour of the day or night, so he just trotted up the steps and walked in the front door. He found the professor in the kitchen having an after-breakfast cigarette and reading the newspaper. As soon as he saw Johnny, the old man put down his newspaper and sat back in his chair waiting. He knew from the expression on Johnny's face that he had something important to tell him. "So, John Michael," said the professor cheerfully, "what do you have on your mind besides hair, eh?" Johnny smiled in a sickly way and sank into a chair across the table from the professor. Slowly and hesitantly, with lots of hemming and hawing, he told about the ghost he had seen last night. For good measure, he threw in the tale of the blue Ford and the midnight phone calls. He had not told the professor about these last 2 things until now because he had been afraid of being laughed at. It was bad enough to have Fergie razzing him. When Johnny had finished talking, the professor took his cigarette out of his mouth and thoughtfully grounded out in the remains of the fried egg on his plate. Then he picked up his fork and began stirring the cigarette and the egg together. And as he stirred it, he talked. Said the professor. "John, I hate to say this, but I think you're spooked by a car that you see occasionally and by some nut who likes to call people up in the middle of the night. It's normal for people to be afraid that they are being followed or persecuted by sinister types. I've had this feeling myself a few times, and each time it's turned out to be my imagination working overtime." The professor paused and pointed his soggy egg fork at Johnny. "However," he said, "that thing you saw outside your window was not a product of your imagination. We are dealing with a mission spirit, a ghost that has come back because there is something it wants us to do. The problem is we still don't know what the stupid nincompoop of a ghost wants. I think you're right about the snuff box. It was given to us so we could use the pawn ticket to get the cane, all right? We have the cane. It's out in the umbrella rack in the front hall. Fine, dandy. But what are we supposed to do with it? Run around sticking people with the sword until the ghost stops showing up? I'm afraid the ghost just hasn't made its intentions very clear. I've done everything I could, including taking the cane down to the hospital to have the ivory handle x-rayed, just to see if there's anything hidden inside. Well, there isn't. It's solid ivory. So for the time being, I think we'd better try to forget the whole peculiar business and hope that the spirit will go bother somebody else for a change. Do you understand what I'm saying? Uh-huh, said Johnny in a weak, throaty voice. He had expected the professor to have something more helpful to say, and he was feeling disappointed. The professor gave Johnny a searching glance, and he read his thoughts. Oh, come on, John, he said, shoving back his chair and standing up suddenly. Cheer up. It's a nice, filthy hot day in August, and the temperature probably won't get any higher than 102 degrees. So forget your troubles and join me in a nice after-breakfast snack of lemonade and fudge brownies. What do you say, eh? And that's the end of Chapter 3.